to this third episode of near death experience and near death like experience. Let me know if the audio and video are coming through. And in the meantime, as people are jumping on, let's just take a few minutes spent together in silence. So as you're coming on, just let me know if the AV stream is coming through. As usual, taking this time to clear space for new perspectives. With each breath, inhaling deeply without too much strain. And exhaling all concepts and misconceptions. Because what we're doing is simply trying to see something in a new way. So we're moving towards what may work and may not work, and going beyond ideas of right and wrong. All right. So hello. Looks like it's coming through. Hello, Lily, Judith, Makiri, Stan. All right. So this is the third episode, perhaps the final episode of this series on near-death experiences. Let's take a moment to just see where we've come with this and what the purpose of this 3-episode series has been. One is really to look at this phenomenon that is really popular in our society of near-death experiences and related experiences, which are called near-death-like experiences, and then to see how that connects and what that tells us about our daily lives. That's really the point here. And so what we've seen in the last couple episodes is that something that seems so otherworldly, something that seems so different, something that seems so mystical, perhaps has roots in this very experience that we're having now, this experience of being a person in a room talking and listening, right? And the connection might be between what we call near-death experience, how it's connected to near-death-like experience, similar kinds of experiences, and how that is a subset of something broader that we call mystical experience, and then how mystical experience itself is actually a subset of something we call experience, right? And at the level of experience, what we're all experiencing now is the broadest possible category, right? In the sense that the actual ingredients and the mechanics of how we are experiencing now is the same for all of these other kinds of experience, mystical, near death like, and so on. It is just that the range at which those mechanics applies and the range which is given attention is different, right? So we're looking to perhaps bring these experiences right to the level of where we are experiencing right now. And hopefully, in that way, understand them a little bit better and also break down some of these walls and open the doors between all these different kinds of experiences rather than making them strange or something different. Because otherwise, what happens is that we have this idea that there's this experience here and then there's something there called near death, or there's something there called mystical, and then this person wants to go somewhere else and have a mystical experience, right? Whereas when we look at the nature of experience itself, then perhaps some of these walls can come down and we can see the wonder and mystery of even apparently mundane experiences. All right. So, with that, thank you for all the comments from last week. There were a lot of questions about this process that we call integrating. I set up a page that may help some people. It's just a couple of the offerings just based on what people asked about last time. All right, that's the link, anupkumar.com/integrate. Just a couple resources on there if people wish to avail themselves. So let me talk about my own experience of integrating after one of these experiences, and let's see where this goes. So first and foremost is that after this experience that I talked about a couple episodes ago, in the next several months, beginning in the next several months to several years, came this process of what we can refer to as integrating. Integrating what? Integrating something, exactly as we said, that seemed so different with everyday life. And to start with, the most important thing to say about it is that it was an incredibly disorienting and disorganizing and difficult experience. In fact, it wasn't really an experience, it's just an ongoing process of life, right? The first 10 or so years of which, 10 plus years of which, were difficult and difficult in different ways and different stages, right? But I don't want to skip over that and sugarcoat that and make it sound as if, as I talk about it, everything is in a nice bow tie. It wasn't that way. It was very much like being in the middle of the ocean and not really knowing how to swim and just trying to, what's that called, tread water, right? And through this process of struggle, through this process of trying to orient north, south, east, and west, through this process of trying to gain sufficient air and gain some balance, eventually learning how to surf life, so to speak. All right. So that's, in a way, we could say what's happening now is surfing life, right? Whereas before it was just trying to come up for air. And so what did that look like? So this period started, it coincided with two other events that happened in my life, right? So this kind of tremendous experience was before or towards the end of medical school. So soon after that came my marriage and my wedding and the beginning of my training in emergency medicine in Philadelphia, right? So what's happening is there's this one event, but then even in life, two very significant events, right? Being in the hospital all the time, being in the face of trauma and all kinds of emergencies and learning how to deal with all of this, and marriage, learning how to deal with that, be a husband, all of this at once was tremendously overwhelming, right? So, which is why I use the metaphor of basically drowning and trying to come up for air. Now, I imagine that, I'm sure you've heard stories, just being in residency can be extremely disorienting because you're up all night and your night turns to day and you're dealing with very sick patients and that itself. But in the context of these other two, it made it even more so. So things like the switching of identity. So many people talk about out of body experiences. So sometimes there would be experiences of identity where the identity would switch, right? In body to out of body, or sometimes what I call trans bodies, not really in or out of the body, it's just including the body, but not necessarily in nor out, right? Different experiences of time, speeding up, slowing down, experiencing identity and the way it relates to space differently. I'm saying all this because to think about changes in the experience of time, changes in the experience of space, changes in the experience of identity, these are some of the most fundamental changes that can happen. In fact, this is what's talked about both in spiritual traditions and what's talked about in descriptions of psychosis, right? Now, they're approached differently, they're placed in different contexts, but I'm saying this just to give a flavor for how intense and fundamental some of these changes were and some of these experiences were. And this is not something that would happen at on any particular time or even with any particular regularity or predictability, but it would just be at different times of the day for different durations, for different intensities. Again, all happening over 10 years and more. And still happening now, but now it's much more of an integrated process and surfing life. So that kind of the feeling of drowning or that kind of struggle that was there then is not there now. Right? So the integrating process continues so long as a person is when we're talking about integrating, first of all, what are we talking about? Integrating these two poles of experience, but really integrating into the society, into a society's ideas of what life is, right? So as long as we have our roles within society, husband, father, physician, anything, right? It might be an artist, it might be a wife, it might be a girlfriend, it might be an athlete. As long as we have these roles in society, there has to be some kind of integrating process because the rules, so to speak, are so different. The beliefs, the framework is so different, right? So the integrating process continues. So having said this, having said the difficulty of it, right? And then so working for 24 hours or 36 hours in the hospital and then coming home and being in a totally different kind of environment. And yet that sense of identity again is shifting. The sense of the mind and what it perceives as the world is shifting. So what helped me through this process? That's really what this is about, right? We could go on forever describing the process and everything, but everybody knows what difficulty feels like. And those of you that have that have had similar experiences also understand the difficulty of it. So what are the things that helped me? So a couple things. A couple that I was very fortunate to have. One is that since childhood, I had had this background in Advaita, in the philosophy of Advaita, right? Which is essentially non-duality. But for me, it wasn't strictly an intellectual kind of process because I had been around people that had dedicated their lives to this since I was a kid, right? That were practicing this, that were talking about it, that were, in a sense, researching it, that were conferring with other groups. This was kind of the environment I was raised in. So, because of that, my framework for what is possible was much more loose, right? I didn't have a rigid framework for what is possible or what life is or what the nature of the world is, all these kinds of things, right? In fact, one of the reasons I went to med school was to kind of reconcile these frameworks and figure out what does the medical science part of it understand. So that's one big thing, right? Having this kind of loose framework that allows different kinds of possibilities to happen and doesn't consider them strange or doesn't consider them, even worse than strange, impossible, right? For experiencing something and yet people say it's impossible, now that creates a kind of a rift in the mind. So that possibility that was there because of Advaita. Number two is I also had a background in medicine, right? So because of that, I could kind of go back and forth with these frameworks and how would different minds understand what is happening, right? That kind of balancing regimen was there. So I could use certain words, certain phrases to translate these experiences, right? Or to kind of make sense of these experiences. That's one. The other thing is I was around a teacher at that time who had been through such things probably decades before in life. And so, because of that, something that might seem very dramatic or something that might seem very unusual became almost blase, right? It became very ordinary. Because I remember he would say things like, even though we didn't talk about these things much, he would simply be like, yeah, yeah, that kind of happens. Yeah, just keep going kind of thing. Whereas in our society, most people that haven't experienced such things, or even if they have experienced it, the framework tends to be happening through a materialist framework. And so that looseness of interpretation isn't there, right? That allowing of the identity to settle into its own range, the allowing of perception, the allowing of thought, the allowing of concept to settle into its own range is often not there. Because in society, it's go, 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 right? Get back to the job or get back to the role. And therefore, there's no space for this integrating process to happen. So this background in Advaita, the background in medicine and how the kind of medical world and the materialist framework would talk about this, as well as having a teacher around once in a blue moon whenever I needed one to just say, hey, this is the direction. This made all the difference in the world, right? Before some of the other things that we'll talk about, right? So why does it make all the difference in the world? Because it essentially buys time for the integrating process to happen. Right? Think about a situation in which something dramatic changes in a person's life, and now they have to go back the next day, go back to work, go back to their roles, and there's no place to talk about this, to integrate this, to find where this fits into their life. This is what happens so often with this entire range of experiencing, whether it's near death like, mystical, or even anything, right? Even if somebody's in a car accident or somebody gets hurt or a loved one passes away, any kind of major influence, if there's no space for that reconciliation and integrating, then that's when things become very tough, or that's when things become even tougher and make it hard to keep going and find a way to keep going. So these were the keys for me. So maybe some of you might find help in kind of loosening the framework of what is possible, what is not possible, and also being in contact with those who have experienced and been through the things that you have experienced, right? That's always helpful. All right. And of course, the other thing is taking time if it's possible. I know it's hard, maybe it's not possible, but taking that time to step back and to allow this process to happen, right? So what I'm going to do now, because I know many have been going through this process as well, let's just take a minute or two. And I want to acknowledge now how difficult this process of integrating can be. And so we welcome into this space that we're all sharing now all the difficulties, all the feelings and thoughts about how hard this is, all the pain, all the suffering. It is all welcomed in this space. And we're acknowledging that in our society, there are not enough open, welcoming, safe spaces for these kinds of experiences. all of the confusion, all of the questions about what this or that is. And having done this, let's talk about a couple of the very practical strategies, right? And these you will see are as plain as daylight, right? Because the things that work are the simple things, are the basics that we often tend to ignore. It's the same as in medicine, right? The basics I talk about are the pillars of nutrition, movement, rest, and connection. And in medicine, you'll see we have so much research going on into the origins of diseases and what to do about them. And yet, in many ways, we know the answers, right? We know that if we pay attention to nutrition, movement, rest, and connection, probably we would at least ameliorate half the experiences of a disease, if not more, right? And so often it's just dismissed as lifestyle. We just call it lifestyle factors. And as soon as we say it's lifestyle factors, it sounds low tech and it sounds like it's not as fancy or as quick as a pill. But in fact, it is these factors that work for most anything, all right, that can improve most any situation, or at least have an effect on it. So, nutrition, movement, rest, and connection, the four pillars, and they can be used across the different bodies: physical, mental, energetic, and so on. And so, you'll see this here in the blueprint. This is what I call blueprint for integrating. That's here. That's from the first book that's back there, Michelangelo's Medicine, Blueprint for Well-Being. But nutrition, what is nutrition? So I found that eating certain foods, right? In my case, it was specifically fresh fruits and vegetables, made a big difference. So in residency, I had been eating all kinds of pizza and wings and basically anything, right? Because I was always hungry, right? Not eating enough and then stuffing my face whenever there was a chance, just poor eating habits. And I found that for a brief time, I actually went completely vegan and even stopped oil, right? I'm not recommending you do this. I'm simply saying what I did, sharing my own experience. I went completely vegan as well as stopped oil, dropped a tremendous amount of weight. I wasn't heavy to begin with, but dropped a tremendous amount of weight. Everybody got worried. This guy's losing so much weight. He's so rail thin. But everything became crystal clear, right? The mind became much more clear. I was able to maneuver the mind and maneuver the range of identity much more easily. So all of this came with that. And eventually I settled on a vegetarian diet, which is what I do now. But everybody, you experiment with this for yourself, right? Some people try eliminating gluten, some people dairy, vegetarian. It doesn't matter. You can eat certain kinds of meats, find the ones that work for you. Whatever it is, just know that the kind of food you eat has a tremendous impact on, especially once the mind goes into a particular range. All right. So nutrition, that's nutrition for the body, but nutrition for the mind is also the conversations that we participate in, right? So is it always conversations about how things are hard and how things don't work and there are no solutions and all the problems? Or are there new approaches, new things to try, right? New frameworks. So this is nutrition for the mind, right? Being in relationship, feeling that nourishment from others, right? It doesn't have to be a whole bunch of people, maybe one person, maybe a book. So nutrition. The second one is movement. I found that moving the body helped. For me, particularly, simply taking the body through its range of motion, right? It doesn't have to be exercise per se. It's wonderful if we can get outside and and run around or play games or play sports or hiking, all those matter. But simply taking the body through its range of motion. So you take your wrist and you simply take it through your range of motion. Remember, from a second mind perspective, what we call the body is the representation of mind. And so taking the body through its range of motion, what it's doing is, in essence, making this mind more flexible, right? Making it more malleable, making it more open, enabling it to see and assimilate more. The other thing this does, moving the body like this, is it loosens up the energetic structures. The energetic structures are not aspects of anatomy in the West, of allopathic anatomy and physiology, but in yoga and Chinese medicine, these structures and movements are well established. So moving through the range of motion will again help that energetic aspect to flow, which simply feels like ease and feels like loosening up the body. Right? Movement at the level of mind is also expressing yourself. So maybe you have some great ideas, some wild ideas, creative ideas. So writing those down, talking to people, right? Getting feedback. Hey, what do you think about this? They might not like it, they might like it, but then incorporating that into your ideas, right? This is moving that mind. Emotions, allowing the emotions to flow, right? Rather than damming up. Maybe it's through writing, maybe it's through sharing them with someone, whichever way it works. The idea is that the body is not a thing. Now, in this integrating process, we're moving from a thing-based world to a process-based world to a consciousness-based world, right? The thing-based world is the world of physicality. It's the world of the objective. It's the world of the object. The process-based world is where the subject and object come into relationship with each other, right? So here, the body is not a thing. It's an ever-flowing river. So think of the body as a river. So an emotion shouldn't stay stagnant, right? A thought shouldn't stay stagnant. So learning to bring these in and take them out, bring these in and let them out. This is constantly renewing the body and the experience. This is movement. And then nutrition, movement, rest, of course, right? Can be an exhausting process, right? It is as if your entire being is running a marathon the whole time. So the importance of rest, which doesn't have to be sleep, of course, but really it's downtime, right? Making time for those things that work for you. And just taking a pause now and then to just shut everything out, shut everything down, taking a pause, and then going back. This is rest. And finally, connection. We can't really say what connection is. Connection is really just being oneself, going to the root of oneself and being oneself. And that's really what this whole process of integrating is about. Integrating is about taking all the layers of what we are, taking the layers of the body, taking the layers of the mind, of the emotions, of the lifetimes, of ideas and concepts and beliefs and traumas and all the good things also, and connecting them down to our root and aligning them with our root. So in the world, that looks like our expression. It might be career, the friendships, the people that we're interacting with. That's what it looks like in the world. And in one's own experience, it's simply the experience of clarity, of ease, right? As these get integrated, the experience becomes clear and easeful. It doesn't mean it's easy, it doesn't mean it's always easy, but that sense of rest, clarity, and ease becomes the dominant experience as opposed to the marathon running and the frenzy. All right, so nutrition, movement, rest, connection. Dina asks, how do we connect? It's a good question. So we can break connection down into three aspects, right? One is connecting with nature, which is so important, right? So literally, when everything becomes so tough, we can just take the body, almost like you're picking it up like a puppet, and go put it out in nature, right? Pick it up from over here and go drop it off there in nature, meaning in not so much a man-made environment, right? When we are inside, as I am now inside, what I am surrounded by essentially is human thought, right? The the architect of this building, the engineers of this building, the people who are doing the actual construction itself. This is the human thoughts materialized are essentially what we're talking about as this house, right? When we're in nature, it's one step before that, right? It's independent of human thought. It's the trees, it's the sky, it's the wind, it's the rivers or the creek, right? And that makes all the difference because human thought has a lot more interpretation and modification in it, whereas nature has less interpretation and modification. It hasn't gone through the human mind, so to speak. And that therefore that sense of ease, especially for those going through this integrating process, the mind is very sensitive and the boundaries between body and mind break down. And so it's always good to go to a place that is simpler, right? In which the interpretation is not as complex, the modifications are not as complex. And that is what nature is, right? And that's why we can feel this connection with the green and with the sky and with the soil, right? Especially connecting directly with the soil, the feet connecting with the soil. You can feel that kind of sense of calm and connection. So that's one kind, is in nature. The other kind is with others, right? So whoever it is, a person that you feel connected with, right? Spending some time with them, either in conversation or without conversation, feeling that bridge that's connecting with others. And it may not be through this process, it might not be a lot of people. It may just be one person, or it may be two or three. If you're lucky, there may be a lot of people in your circle like this. So connecting with nature, connecting with others, and finally connecting with oneself. And here we'll say, of course, we talk about connecting with oneself as meditation or mindfulness. And if that works, great. But understand that in this process, right, when we talk about meditation and mindfulness in general in society, yes, it's a great thing and it's helpful to introspect. But of course, everybody is different. What is meant by meditation is different. The mind is different. So in this kind of process of integrating where that intensity is there, meditation may be too intense. It may be too intense an activity, right? There were times during that process where initially I had been meditating a lot and I stopped for a long time because there was too much to integrate already. If I just kept meditating and mining the material, then it was just too much to process. So I stopped meditating for a while, right? And so you may have to do that. And it may not be meditation then changes. It goes from being an activity to simply being your nature, right? It's meditation is not something you do, it's essentially what you are. So, and I don't mean that we're sitting there meditating, but that the mind becomes meditative. That is part of this integrating process. So, in connecting with self, it may be meditating, it may not be meditating, right? But understand that everything that this process is doing is ultimately connecting with self, even if it's not something that the individual mind understands or can make happen, right? This whole process is about that. It has to go through a process. So, yes, nutrition. Mary says, I did that as well. Tracy says, church helped me. Exactly. So, things, religion, spirituality can be very helpful. In some cases, they can be very problematic. It all depends on if it gives someone either a sense of community or some sense of structure or some sense of navigating what is happening. But if the beliefs are contrary, right, or if they're kind of persecutory, or if they're making the experiences wrong, or that we should ignore them or throw them out, then it becomes a problem. So obviously, all this has to be on an individual basis. Connecting with oneself, barefoot walking. All right. So these were the things that I found helpful. And through this, through all of this, especially through the first few, which is having the background in Advaita, having the physician background, but then also being around someone who had been through it, this kind of gave that time to create my own sense of meaning around this, right? Which is where the three minds framework came from, right? The three minds framework is essentially a way of describing the ranges of all experiences, right? And so it's not really a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of how much it encompasses and whether it provides a useful map. So with that, I think this series will come to an end. And I think what we'll start next week is we'll look at the 10 common misconceptions about consciousness. All right, it's like a top 10 list. And we'll do one each week. So it'll be short, just a few minutes each week, just something to mull over. 10 common misconceptions about consciousness. If you'd like to learn more about this process of integrating, I will probably add more resources. This is the page. I'll probably add more resources as people ask questions. That usually gets the ideas flowing, and whatever comes up very frequently, I'll add there. You can also check out the blog. There are many answers to previous questions there, and we'll go from there.